January 20, 1953, 8:45 in the morning. The White House. The temperature outside was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. A bitter winter wind cut across the north lawn, rattling the bare branches of the elm trees that lined the driveway. President Harry Truman stood at the window of the Oval Office, watching a black limousine pull up to the north portico. His hands were clasped behind his back. His jaw was tight. He had been awake since 5:30 that morning, unable to sleep, knowing what this day would bring. Inside that car sat Dwight David Eisenhower, the man who would become the 34th President of the United States in less than 4 hours. The man Truman had once called the greatest military leader America had ever produced. The man Truman had personally promoted to 5-star general. The man Truman had appointed as Army Chief of Staff. The man Truman had made the first Supreme Commander of NATO. The man Truman had offered to support for president on the Democratic ticket in 1948, with Truman himself stepping down to be vice president, the man who now refused to step foot inside the White House. Truman had planned this morning carefully. He had instructed the kitchen staff to prepare coffee, the good coffee that Eisenhower liked. He had arranged for light refreshments in the Blue Room. He had set aside 30 minutes for a private conversation before they would leave for the Capitol. Just two men who had worked together to win a war and build a peace, sharing a final moment of civility before the transfer of power. It was a tradition that dated back generations. Every incoming president since William Howard Taft had stopped inside the White House for at least a brief visit with his predecessor. It was a gesture of respect, a recognition that the office was bigger than any one man, that democracy required grace and continuity. Mamie and Dwight Eisenhower sat in their limousine at the entrance. The engine was running. Exhaust poured from the tailpipe into the cold morning air. The door did not open. They would not enter. They would not come inside for even 5 minutes of courtesy. White House staff stood in the hallway, confused. The ushers did not know what to do. Should they go outside and ask again? Should they wait? The minutes ticked by. 8:46. 8:47. 8:48. The head usher, J.B. West, stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. He had worked in the White House for years. He had seen difficult transitions before, but he had never seen anything like this. He would later write in his memoirs that he was glad he was not going to be in that car for the ride to the Capitol. CBS correspondent Eric Severeid stood on the lawn with other reporters, watching the limousine sit motionless at the entrance. He could see the tension in every person present. Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably. White House staff whispered to each other. Photographers waited, unsure whether to take pictures of a scene that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. Severeid would later call it a shocking moment, a break with American tradition so stark it felt like a wound in the fabric of democracy itself. What had happened between these two men? How did a friendship that helped win World War II and build NATO turn into hatred so bitter that one man could not stand to sit next to the other? How did the president who made a general into a national hero end up banned from ever setting foot in that general's White House? This is the story of how Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower went from the closest of allies to the most estranged leaders in American history. And it started with a simple act of political ambition that Truman saw as the ultimate betrayal. July 1945. Germany. The war in Europe had been over for 2 months. The smell of gunpowder and smoke still lingered in the ruins of German cities. Millions of displaced persons wandered the countryside, searching for home. The Allied occupation was barely organized. Europe was in chaos. President Truman had been in office for exactly 3 months. Franklin Roosevelt had died suddenly on April 12, 1945. Truman, who had been vice president for only 82 days, found himself leading a nation at war. He made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He managed the final defeat of Japan. He attended the Potsdam Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to negotiate the post-war order. Now, in mid-July, Truman stood on the Autobahn outside Frankfurt with General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. The Autobahn was Hitler's signature achievement, a massive highway system that cut across Germany. American engineers were impressed by its design. Truman wanted to see it for himself. Eisenhower gave him a personal tour. They walked along the concrete roadway, they calmed, examined the bridges, the overpasses, the engineering that made high-speed travel possible. Truman was fascinated. He had grown up on dirt roads in Missouri. The idea of a national highway system appealed to him immediately. But Truman was not just there to look at roads. He was there to get to know Eisenhower. Eisenhower was 54 years old, the most famous soldier in the world. He had just led the largest military invasion in history. D-Day on June 6, 1944, the liberation of France, the defeat of Nazi Germany. More than 2 million Allied troops under his command, operations across multiple countries, coordinating with difficult allies, managing egos and logistics and strategy on a scale never before attempted. Eisenhower had succeeded where others might have failed. He was brilliant, but more importantly, he was diplomatic. He knew how to work with the British, with the French, with difficult personalities like General Bernard Montgomery and General George Patton. He made decisions under impossible pressure and took responsibility when things went wrong. Truman saw all of this. He saw a leader. He saw someone who could unite people, who could manage complexity, who could handle the weight of command without breaking, and Truman knew his own limitations. He was a farmer's son from Independence, Missouri. He had served in World War I as an artillery captain. He had spent most of his career in local politics, working with the Pendergast machine in Kansas City. He had been a county judge, then a senator. He was competent, hard-working, honest. But he was not a giant. He was not Roosevelt. He was not a natural president. Standing on that autobahn with Eisenhower, Truman made a decision. This man, this general, should be president. America needed someone like Eisenhower to lead it through the dangerous years ahead. The Soviet Union was expanding. Communism was spreading. The world was splitting into rival camps. America needed the best leader it could find. Truman looked at Eisenhower and said something extraordinary. "General, there is nothing you may want that I will not try to help you get. That includes the presidency in 1948. Eisenhower was stunned. He stammered a response. He said he was flattered but not interested. He was a soldier. He had no political experience. He did not want to be president. He wanted to finish his military service, retire, and live quietly. Truman pressed the point. He told Eisenhower that leadership was leadership. The skills that won wars could win peace. Truman said he would step aside if Eisenhower would run on the Democratic ticket in 1948. Truman would take the vice presidency again, just like he had under Roosevelt. Eisenhower would be the presidential nominee. Eisenhower declined politely but firmly. He thanked Truman for the offer. He said he believed in civilian control of the military. Soldiers should not become politicians. It was bad for democracy. He wanted no part of it. Truman accepted the answer, but he did not stop believing Eisenhower should be president. Over the next 7 years, Truman would mention it repeatedly, publicly, privately, to reporters, to friends, to anyone who would listen. Eisenhower was the man. Eisenhower was the one who could lead America. The two men stayed close. After the war, Truman appointed Eisenhower as Army Chief of Staff in November 1945. They worked together on demobilizing millions of soldiers, on occupation policy in Germany and Japan, on the early stages of what would become the Cold War. On February 7, 1948, Truman presented Eisenhower with his 4th Distinguished Service Medal at a ceremony at the Pentagon. It was a formal event, full of pomp and respect. Photographers captured the moment, Truman shaking Eisenhower's hand, both men smiling. The president and his most trusted general, behind the scenes, their relationship was even light, warmer. They wrote letters to each other regularly. Truman sought Eisenhower's advice on military matters. Eisenhower kept Truman informed about army operations and personnel. There was genuine affection between them. Truman saw Eisenhower as the son of a great soldier, someone who embodied the best of American values. Eisenhower saw Truman as a decisive leader who had made the hardest choices any president had ever faced. In 1948, Truman won re-election in a stunning upset. He did not need Eisenhower after all. The country, it seemed, had decided Truman was good enough on his own. But Truman never stopped believing Eisenhower should be president, and he never stopped telling people so, publicly, privately, constantly. Eisenhower was the man. Eisenhower was the one who should lead America. This constant praise would, eventually, become the seed of their destruction. The problem was Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was a first-term Republican senator from Wisconsin, elected in 1946 at age 38. He had served as a circuit court judge before the war, then as a Marine officer in the Pacific. He returned to Wisconsin with an inflated combat record and political ambitions. His first years in the Senate were unremarkable. He sponsored no major legislation. He attracted little attention. Colleagues considered him lazy and opportunistic. Then, on February 9, 1950, McCarthy gave a speech that changed American politics. He spoke to the Republican Women's Club in Wheeling, West Virginia. It was supposed to be a routine political speech, the kind senators gave dozens of times a year. But McCarthy said something explosive. He claimed to have a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. He waved papers in the air. He said he had names, evidence, proof of a massive conspiracy. The speech was a lie. McCarthy had no list. The number 205 was invented. But the claim was sensational, and newspapers across the country ran it as front-page news: communist infiltration. Traitors in the government. A senator with proof. McCarthy became famous overnight. He was invited onto radio programs. Newspapers requested interviews. He gave more speeches, making more accusations. The numbers changed. Sometimes it was 205 communists, sometimes 81, sometimes 57. The inconsistency did not matter. What mattered was the fear. Americans in 1950 were terrified of communism. The Soviet Union had developed atomic weapons in 1949, years ahead of American estimates. China had fallen to communist forces led by Mao Zedong. The Korean War had started in June 1950, with communist North Korea invading South Korea. Soviet spies had been uncovered in the United States, including Klaus Fuchs, who had worked on the Manhattan Project and passed atomic secrets to Moscow. People wanted someone to blame. McCarthy gave them scapegoats. He named names. He accused government officials, diplomats, military officers, academics, Hollywood writers. Most of his accusations were baseless. Some were completely fabricated. But in the climate of fear that gripped America, accusations alone were enough to destroy careers. McCarthy was reckless, paranoid, and dangerous. But he was also politically powerful. Millions of Americans believed him. They wrote letters supporting him. They voted for candidates he endorsed. Republican leaders, seeing his popularity, chose not to confront him. Democrats who criticized McCarthy found themselves accused of being communist sympathizers. One of McCarthy's favorite targets was General George Marshall. Marshall had been Army Chief of Staff during World War II. He was the architect of American victory, the man who had built the United States military from a small, poorly equipped force into the most powerful army the world had ever seen. In 1941, the army had fewer than 200,000 soldiers and equipment left over from World War I. By 1945, it had more than 8 million soldiers, the best weapons, the best training, the best logistics. Marshall had done that. He had selected commanders, organized divisions, coordinated with allies, planned operations. Every major decision of the war had crossed his desk. Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, MacArthur, all of them reported to Marshall. When they needed support, Marshall got it for them. When they made mistakes, Marshall protected them. After the war, President Truman appointed Marshall as Secretary of State in January 1947. Marshall created the European Recovery Program, which became known as the Marshall Plan. It provided more than $13 billion in aid to rebuild Western Europe, preventing economic collapse and stopping the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan was one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives in American history. In 1950, Truman appointed Marshall as Secretary of Defense. The Korean War had just started, and Truman needed someone he could trust to run the Pentagon. Marshall came out of retirement to serve. In 1953, Marshall would receive the Nobel Peace Prize for the Marshall Plan. Marshall was also the man who had made Dwight Eisenhower's career possible. In 1941, Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel stationed at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. He was 51 years old, unknown outside the Army, with no combat experience. His career had been respectable but unspectacular. He had spent most of it in staff positions, working for other generals, writing plans and reports. He was considered competent but not exceptional. George Marshall saw something different. Marshall met Eisenhower briefly in 1941 and was impressed by his clarity of thought, his ability to analyze complex problems, and his calm demeanor under pressure. When America entered World War II in December 1941, Marshall brought Eisenhower to Washington to work in the War Plans Division. Over the next 2 years, Marshall promoted Eisenhower repeatedly. Lieutenant Colonel to Brigadier General in September 1941, Major General in March 1942, Lieutenant General in July 1942. Marshall leapfrogged Eisenhower over dozens of more senior officers, officers with combat experience, officers who had been generals for years. In June 1942, Marshall appointed Eisenhower as commander of U.S. forces in Europe. In November 1942, Eisenhower commanded the Allied invasion of North Africa. In December 1943, Marshall named him Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, giving him authority over all Allied forces preparing for the invasion of France. Without George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower would have spent World War II behind a desk in Washington, writing staff papers and attending meetings. He would have retired as a colonel or maybe a brigadier general. He would have been forgotten by history. Eisenhower knew this. He acknowledged it publicly. He called Marshall his mentor, his patron, the man who had believed in him when no one else did. Eisenhower owed everything to Marshall: his rank, his command, his fame, his place in history. All of it came from George Marshall's decision to promote an unknown staff officer to supreme command. Senator Joseph McCarthy did not care about any of that. In June 1951, McCarthy delivered a 60,000-word speech on the floor of the United States Senate. The speech lasted 3 hours. McCarthy accused George Marshall of being part of a communist conspiracy. He called Marshall a liar. He said Marshall had deliberately lost China to the communists. He accused Marshall of undermining American foreign policy to benefit the Soviet Union. He stopped just short of calling Marshall a traitor, but the implication was clear. McCarthy's central claim was that Marshall, as Secretary of State, had failed to support Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek adequately, leading to the communist victory in China in 1949. McCarthy argued this was not incompetence but deliberate betrayal, part of a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. The speech was deranged. It was full of distortions, half-truths, and outright fabrications. Most senators could not sit through it. By the time McCarthy finished, only 2 senators remained in the chamber. The rest had walked out. But McCarthy was not speaking to the Senate. He was speaking to the American people. He published the speech as a book titled America's Retreat from Victory, The Story of George Catlett Marshall. The book sold tens of thousands of copies. McCarthy's supporters read it and believed it. They saw Marshall not as a hero but as a villain, a tool of bickened, tame, communist subversion. President Truman was furious. Marshall was his friend, his advisor, one of the most honorable men he had ever known. McCarthy's attacks were slander, lies designed to destroy a man who had devoted his life to serving America. Truman spoke out against McCarthy repeatedly. He called McCarthy's tactics un-American, a threat to democracy itself. He said McCarthy was doing more damage to the United States than any communist agent ever could. He compared McCarthyism to the Ku Klux Klan and said both were rooted in fear and hatred rather than reason, but Truman's attacks only made McCarthy stronger. Every time the president denounced McCarthy, McCarthy's followers rallied to his defense. They saw Truman as part of the problem, a weak leader who had allowed communists to infiltrate the government. The more Truman fought McCarthy, the more popular McCarthy became. By 1952, polls showed that nearly half of all Americans had a favorable view of McCarthy. He was one of the most influential politicians in the country. And then Dwight Eisenhower decided to run for president. Eisenhower announced his candidacy in June 1952. He was running as a Republican, not a Democrat. This surprised no one. Eisenhower had always been more conservative than Truman. His decision to run as a Republican made sense politically. What shocked Truman was that Eisenhower was running at all. For years, Eisenhower had insisted he had no interest in politics. He had turned down Truman's offer in 1948. He had turned down similar offers from Republicans. He had said publicly, repeatedly, that he would never run for office. He was a soldier, not a politician. But now, suddenly, he was a candidate. And not just any candidate. He was the Republican nominee, running against Truman's party, running against everything Truman had built. Truman felt betrayed. He had promoted Eisenhower. He had praised Eisenhower. He had offered to make Eisenhower president. And now Eisenhower was repaying him by trying to destroy the Democratic Party. Truman could have stayed neutral. He could have remained presidential, above the fray, but he did not. He campaigned hard for the Democratic nominee, Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, and he went after Eisenhower personally. Truman's attacks were brutal. He said Eisenhower did not know any more about politics than a pig knows about Sunday. He called Eisenhower naive. He said Eisenhower was surrounded by cronies and reactionaries who would control him like a puppet. He accused Eisenhower of betraying the soldiers who had fought under him by aligning with Republicans who had opposed military funding. These attacks hurt Eisenhower deeply. He was not used to political combat. In the military, criticism came through official channels and was based on performance. Political attacks were personal, vicious, public. Eisenhower took Truman's words as attacks on his character, his intelligence, his integrity. Emmett John Hughes, one of Eisenhower's speechwriters, later wrote that the mere mention of Harry Truman's name brought fast flashes of antipathy in Eisenhower. Just hearing Truman's name made Eisenhower angry, but the real break came in Wisconsin. October 3, 1952, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Senator Joseph McCarthy's home state. The temperature was 48 degrees. Rain fell steadily. Inside the Milwaukee auditorium, more than 5,000 people packed the seats, waiting for Dwight Eisenhower to speak. Eisenhower was exhausted. He had been campaigning non-stop for 4 months, speeches in every state, rallies in every city, handshakes and photo opportunities from dawn until midnight. He was 62 years old, and the pace was brutal. But the election was close. Every state mattered. Wisconsin had 12 electoral votes. He could not afford to lose Wisconsin. McCarthy's influence in Wisconsin was enormous. He had won re-election to the Senate in 1952 with 54% of the vote, even as other Wisconsin Republicans won by larger margins. His supporters were passionate, organized, and loyal. They saw him as a hero fighting communism. Any Republican who criticized McCarthy risked losing their support. Eisenhower did not like McCarthy. He thought McCarthy was a demagogue, a liar who damaged the Republican Party and the country. In private conversations, Eisenhower called McCarthy a menace, but publicly, Eisenhower said nothing. His campaign strategy was to unify the Republican Party, to bring together moderates and conservatives, to win by building the broadest possible coalition. Attacking McCarthy would split the party and hand the election to the Democrats. Eisenhower's speechwriters had prepared remarks for the Milwaukee event that included a strong defense of George Marshall. The paragraph praised Marshall as a man and a soldier of the highest character. It condemned those who made reckless accusations against honorable public servants. It said that attacks like McCarthy's represented a sobering lesson in the way freedom must not defend itself. The paragraph did not mention McCarthy by name, but everyone would know who it was about. It was Eisenhower's chance to defend his mentor, to stand up for the man who had made his career possible, to draw a line between responsible conservatism and McCarthy's reckless demagoguery. The speech was written. The sixth draft included the Marshall defense. Press aides had shown advance copies to reporters. The New York Times correspondent William Lawrence knew the paragraph was coming. He had already written the first part of his story. Eisenhower defends Marshall in McCarthy's home state. It would be front-page news. But that afternoon, everything changed. Governor Walter Kohler, Jr. of Wisconsin, came to see Eisenhower at his hotel. Kohler was a moderate Republican, a businessman who had been elected governor in 1950. He did not like McCarthy's methods, but he understood McCarthy's power. Kohler brought other Wisconsin Republican leaders with him. State Party Chairman Henry Ringling, Congressman Charles Kirsten, National Committeeman Werner Lorenz, they were all worried. They told Eisenhower that defending Marshall would be seen as an attack on McCarthy. Wisconsin Republicans loved McCarthy. If Eisenhower criticized him, even indirectly, Wisconsin voters would be angry. They might stay home on Election Day. They might vote for the Democratic candidate, Adlai Stevenson. Wisconsin's 12 electoral votes could swing the entire election. The Wisconsin Republicans were blunt. Do not give that speech. Delete the paragraph about Marshall. Do not mention McCarthy. Talk about communism in general terms. Praise Wisconsin Republicans. Unify the party. Win the election. There would be time to deal with McCarthy later, after Eisenhower was president. Eisenhower listened. His campaign manager, Sherman Adams, was in the room. So were his top advisers. They debated for more than an hour. Some urged Eisenhower to give the speech as written. Marshall deserved to be defended. It was the right thing to do. Others argued that politics was about compromise, about choosing battles carefully, about winning first and governing later. Eisenhower was torn. He had spent his entire adult life in the military, where loyalty was paramount. You did not abandon your comrades. You did not let attacks go unanswered. Marshall had given him everything. How could he stand silent while McCarthy destroyed Marshall's reputation? But Eisenhower was also a politician now, inexperienced and learning as he went. His advisers told him this was how politics worked. You made compromises. You calculated costs and benefits. You did what was necessary to win, and winning meant keeping Wisconsin in the Republican column. Eisenhower made his decision. He agreed to delete the paragraph defending Marshall. Press Secretary James Haggerty took the speech and crossed out 74 words. The paragraph about Marshall was gone. In its place, Eisenhower would speak more generally about the danger of communism and the need for vigilance. He would praise Wisconsin Republicans, including McCarthy, for their dedication to fighting subversion. That evening, Eisenhower walked onto the stage at the Milwaukee Auditorium. The crowd roared. Flashbulbs popped. Newsreel cameras rolled. Senator Joseph McCarthy was on the platform with Eisenhower, smiling, waving to the crowd. Eisenhower shook his hand. The photographers captured the moment. The next day, newspapers across America would run the picture. Eisenhower and McCarthy together, allies in the fight against communism. Eisenhower gave his speech. He talked about the Korean War, about inflation, about corruption in Washington. He praised Wisconsin's Republicans for their vigilance against communist infiltration. He said communists had penetrated America's schools, unions, media, and government. He pledged to root them out. The crowd cheered. Eisenhower never mentioned George Marshall. He never condemned McCarthy's methods. He never drew the line between responsible anti-communism and reckless witch hunts. McCarthy stood with him on stage the entire time, beaming. When the speech ended, McCarthy came forward. He shook Eisenhower's hand again. He told reporters he was proud to support Eisenhower for president. The Wisconsin Republicans were thrilled. The event was a success. Eisenhower would win Wisconsin. But William Lawrence of the New York Times knew something was wrong. He had seen the advance copy of the speech. He knew the Marshall paragraph had been in the 6th draft. Now it was gone. He started asking questions. Campaign aides tried to deflect. They said the speech had been edited for time. They said Eisenhower had already defended Marshall in other speeches. They said it was not a big deal. Lawrence did not believe them. He checked with other reporters. They confirmed it. Eisenhower had deleted his defense of Marshall to avoid offending McCarthy. In McCarthy's home state, with McCarthy sitting behind him on stage, Eisenhower had chosen political expediency over loyalty to his mentor. The next morning, October 4th, 1952, the New York Times ran the story on page 1, Eisenhower drops Marshall from speech. The article explained that Eisenhower had planned to defend Marshall against McCarthy's attacks, but had deleted the passage after meeting with Wisconsin Republicans. The article included McCarthy's accusations against Marshall and noted that Eisenhower had said nothing to refute them. The reaction was immediate and savage. Newspapers across the country condemned Eisenhower. The Washington Post ran an editorial titled, "A Sorry Performance." The St. Louis Post-Dispatch called it a betrayal. Columnists who had supported Eisenhower turned against him. Even some Republicans were disgusted. Senator William Benton of Connecticut, a Democrat, said Eisenhower had shown cowardice in the face of demagoguery. Former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who had served under Truman, said the incident revealed Eisenhower's character. He said Eisenhower was willing to sacrifice principle for political gain, to abandon friends when it was convenient, to tolerate lies rather than defend truth. Harry Truman's reaction was the most cutting. He was campaigning for Adlai Stevenson in St. Louis when he heard about the Wisconsin speech. Reporters asked for his comment. Truman did not hold back. He said it was one of the most shocking things in the history of this country. He said the trouble with Eisenhower was simple. He is just a coward. He ought to be ashamed for what he did. Truman elaborated in later speeches. He said George Marshall had made Eisenhower's career. Marshall had seen potential in an obscure staff officer and given him opportunities no one else would have. Marshall had promoted him, protected him, trusted him with the most important command in American history. And now, when McCarthy was destroying Marshall's reputation with lies, Eisenhower would not even speak up for him. To Truman, this was not politics. This was not strategy. This was moral cowardice. This was betrayal of the worst kind. A man who would abandon his mentor to win votes was not fit to be president. Eisenhower tried to defend himself. He said he had already praised Marshall publicly in other speeches. He said he did not believe in attacking fellow Republicans. He said his goal was to unite the party, not divide it. None of that mattered to Truman. The damage was done. Truman had watched Eisenhower refuse to defend the man who had created him, and Truman decided that Dwight Eisenhower was not the man he thought he was. The campaign got worse. Truman attacked Eisenhower more harshly. Eisenhower grew more bitter toward Truman. By election day, they were 2p in, not speaking. Eisenhower won in a landslide. He carried 39 states. He won the Electoral College 442 to 89. It was one of the most decisive victories in American history. But the victory did not ease the tension. It made things worse. November 18th, 1952. 2 weeks after the election. The White House. Truman invited Eisenhower to Washington for a transition meeting. Eisenhower came with advisors Joseph Dodge and Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Truman was waiting with his staff. The meeting was tense and unproductive. Eisenhower sat with his face frozen in what Truman called a grimness. He did not smile. He looked tense. He seemed like he did not want to be there. Truman tried to brief Eisenhower on Korea, on the Soviet Union, on budget matters, on staff operations. Eisenhower listened but barely responded. Later, Eisenhower would write that the meeting added little to my knowledge, nor did it affect my planning for the new administration. Truman felt insulted. He was trying to help. He was trying to make the transition smooth. He had information Eisenhower needed. But Eisenhower treated him like an enemy, someone to be endured rather than consulted. The meeting lasted less than 2 hours. When it was over, Eisenhower left quickly. Truman wrote in his diary that night that Eisenhower and his advisors were afraid of some kind of trick. They did not trust him. They thought he was trying to manipulate them. A few weeks later, Truman invited Eisenhower to come back to Washington for a pre-Christmas lunch at the White House. Eisenhower ignored the invitation. He did not even respond. The hatred was now complete. January 20, 1953. Inauguration Day. The morning started badly. Eisenhower had decided, without telling Truman, to wear a Homburg hat instead of the traditional silk top hat. This was a small thing, but it was deliberate. Eisenhower was breaking protocol, making a point. He was the new president, and he would do things his way. Truman found out about the hat change from the newspapers. It was petty, but it stung. Then came the moment at the White House entrance. The Eisenhowers arrived at 8:45 in the morning. The Secret Service opened the car door. Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower stayed in the car. Truman waited inside. He had prepared coffee, breakfast, a warm welcome. The door stayed closed. The Eisenhowers would not come in. After several minutes, Truman gave up. He walked outside, down the steps, to the car. He got in. The car pulled away. The ride to the Capitol was 12 minutes. It felt like 12 hours. They barely spoke. Eisenhower stared out the window. Truman tried to make conversation. Nothing worked. The silence was thick, hostile, suffocating. At one point, Eisenhower asked who had ordered his son John back from Korea. John Eisenhower was serving in the army in Korea. Someone had arranged for him to return to Washington for the inauguration. Truman said he had done it. He thought it was right and proper for Eisenhower's son to witness his father being sworn in as president. Eisenhower said nothing. No thank you. No acknowledgement, just silence. They arrived at the Capitol. Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the oath of office. Eisenhower became the 34th president. He gave his inaugural address about America's responsibility to lead the free world. The ceremony ended. Truman went to Union Station. More than 5,000 people were there to see him off. They cheered for him, chanted his name, thanked him for his service. Truman boarded the train back to Missouri with tears in his eyes. He would not see the White House again for 8 years. Dwight Eisenhower was president for 2 terms, from January 1953 to January 1961. 8 years, 2,922 days. In all that time, Eisenhower never once invited Harry Truman to the White House. Not once. Not for a ceremony, not for a dinner, not for advice, not for anything. The two men never had a single conversation. They never exchanged letters except for a brief thank you note Eisenhower sent a few weeks after the inauguration. They had no contact whatsoever. This was unprecedented. Former presidents traditionally remained in contact with their successors. They offered advice, attended ceremonies, participated in national events. The office of the presidency was a kind of fraternity. Men who had held the job understood each other in ways no one else could. But Eisenhower wanted nothing to do with Truman. He refused to speak his name in public. He ordered his staff to avoid mentioning Truman. When asked about Truman's presidency, Eisenhower gave curt, dismissive answers or changed the subject. Truman was hurt, then angry, then bitter. He told friends he could not mention Eisenhower without using profanity. Biographer David McCullough documented this. In private conversations, Truman called Eisenhower every foul name he could think of. In 1953, Eisenhower traveled to Missouri. Truman called the hotel where Eisenhower was staying. He wanted to pay a courtesy visit. He was told the president was too busy. Eisenhower later claimed he never received the message, but Truman never believed that. The coldness continued year after year. But eventually, someone tried to fix it. His name was Bryce Harlow. He was one of Eisenhower's senior aides, serving as administrative assistant to the president and later as deputy assistant for congressional affairs. Harlow was smart, loyal, and honest. He told Eisenhower things Eisenhower did not want to hear. In May 1958, Harlow decided it was time to end the feud. He went to Eisenhower and said it was wrong for two former allies to remain enemies. Truman had done a lot for Eisenhower. He had promoted him, supported him, made him Army Chief of Staff, made him the first Supreme Commander of NATO. They should reconcile. Eisenhower exploded. Harlow later said Eisenhower was crazy as hell at the suggestion. He said Truman had attacked him viciously during the campaign. Truman had called him a coward. Truman had questioned his intelligence. Why should he reach out to Truman? Harlow stood his ground. He said Eisenhower would eventually regret the estrangement. It was beneath the dignity of the presidency. Future historians would judge him harshly for it. Eisenhower calmed down. He thought about it. Finally, he said he would consider inviting Truman to something, but he added, he will not come. Harlow proposed inviting Truman to the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier for the Korean War at Arlington National Cemetery. The war had started under Truman and ended under Eisenhower. Both men had a connection to it. It was appropriate. Eisenhower agreed. The invitation was sent. Truman declined. He said he had plans to travel to Europe. Eisenhower sent a second invitation. Truman declined again. Years later, Truman told people he had never been invited to the White House during Eisenhower's presidency. When confronted with evidence of the invitations, Truman said he did not remember them. Some historians believe he was lying. Others think he genuinely convinced himself the invitations never happened. Either way, the estrangement continued. They did see each other occasionally, but only at funerals. October 20, 1959. Fort Myer Chapel, Virginia. The funeral of General George Marshall. Marshall had died on October 16 at the age of 78. He was buried with full military honors. Every major figure in American government attended. President Eisenhower sat in the front pew. Former President Truman sat next to him. It was the first time they had been together since Inauguration Day in 1953. 6 years, 9 months. They did not speak. They sat side by side, staring straight ahead through the entire service. When it was over, they left separately. November 16, 1961. Bonham, Texas. The funeral of Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. Rayburn had been Speaker for 17 years, the most powerful Democrat in Congress. His funeral brought together President John Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, former President Eisenhower, and former President Truman. They sat together in the front row. Kennedy, Johnson, Eisenhower, Truman. The four most powerful men in America, side by side. Eisenhower and Truman still did not speak. They acknowledged each other with brief nods. That was all. But something had changed. The rage had faded. What remained was sadness, regret, a sense of wasted time. November 22, 1963. Dallas, Texas. President John Kennedy was assassinated. 3 days later, November 25, Washington, D.C. Kennedy's funeral. Former presidents Eisenhower and Truman attended. After the service at the Capitol, they rode together to Arlington National Cemetery for the burial. Then they went to Blair House, where Truman was staying. For the first time in more than 10 years, they had coffee together. They sat in Blair House for more than an hour. They talked about Kennedy, about the Cold War, about their own years in office. They avoided the painful subjects. They did not discuss the 1952 campaign. They did not mention McCarthy or Marshall or the inauguration, but they talked. For the first time since that frozen car ride in January 1953, they had an actual conversation. When it was over, they shook hands. They agreed to stay in touch, and they did. Not often, not warmly, but they did. In 1961, before Kennedy's assassination, Truman had invited Eisenhower to visit the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. Eisenhower was planning his own presidential library in Abilene, Kansas. He wanted to see how Truman's library was planning his own presidential library, set up. Truman gave Eisenhower a personal tour. They walked through the exhibits together. They discussed how presidential papers should be organized, how museums should be designed, what future researchers would need. It was professional, cordial, even friendly. The final time they met was in 1966, a United Nations luncheon in Kansas City. Both men attended. Eisenhower's brother Milton sat with them. He later said that all the old animosities were forgotten. They had quite a good time together. They were old men by then. Truman was 82. Eisenhower was 76. The passions of 1952 seemed distant, almost foolish. They had both been presidents. They had both carried the weight of the world. They understood each other in ways few people could. But the reconciliation came too late. Dwight Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969. He was 78 years old. He had suffered multiple heart attacks in his final years. He was buried in Abilene, Kansas, with full military honors. Harry Truman died on December 26, 1972. He was 88 years old. He was buried in the courtyard of the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. In their memoirs, both men wrote about each other. The passages were brief, careful, devoid of emotion. Eisenhower acknowledged Truman's role in promoting him to high command. Truman acknowledged Eisenhower's brilliance as a military leader. But neither man discussed the campaign of 1952. Neither man explained what had really gone wrong. Historians have debated it ever since. Some blame Truman for attacking Eisenhower so personally during the campaign. Some blame Eisenhower for running as a Republican after Truman had supported him for years. Some blame both men for letting pride get in the way of reconciliation. But the real answer is simpler. It was not about policy, it was not about party, it was about loyalty. Truman believed Eisenhower had betrayed him by running against the Democratic Party. But more than that, Truman believed Eisenhower had betrayed George Marshall by refusing to defend him against McCarthy. That was the unforgivable sin. Marshall had made Eisenhower, and Eisenhower had abandoned him when he needed support most. Eisenhower believed Truman had betrayed him by attacking him so viciously during the campaign. Eisenhower had given his life to serving his country. He had commanded armies, defeated Hitler, built NATO, and Truman repaid him by calling him a coward, questioning his intelligence, treating him like a fool. Both men were right. Both men were wrong. Both men let their hurt feelings destroy a friendship that had helped change the world. The cost was real. For 8 years, America had no contact between its sitting president and its most recent former president. Eisenhower could have benefited from Truman's advice on domestic policy, on dealing with Congress, on managing crises. Truman could have benefited from staying engaged with national affairs, from feeling respected and valued. Instead, they gave each other silence. The lesson is not complicated. Leadership requires humility. It requires forgiveness. It requires putting the relationship above the grudge, the mission above the ego. Truman and Eisenhower failed at this. Two of the greatest leaders of the 20th century, two men who had worked together to win a world war and build a lasting peace, could not get past their own wounded pride. They built highways and suburbs and prosperity. They contained communism and prevented World War III. They gave America stability and confidence in dangerous times. But they never forgave each other. Not really. Not when it mattered. And that is how a president ends up banned from the White House. Not because of policy differences or political disagreements, but because two proud men could not admit they had both been wrong. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from American history. Subscribe to stay connected with these forgotten chapters. Each one matters. Each one teaches us something about leadership, about loyalty, about the cost of pride. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from coast to coast, from history enthusiasts to students to veterans. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.